Hi, and welcome to part 2 of Big Ideas. Now we're actually moving on to those big ideas. So if you had to break it down into what are the major components of, anatomy and physiology when you take them together, you really have to break it down into these parts. The first major idea is structure and function are related. So those two things come together. It is this shape because it needs to have a particular function. So even at the level of the molecule, the structure of the molecule determines what the cell looks like. And the cell is going to build those tissues. And from then on, we build up and up. So structure and function, always related. The second thing we want to look at are the biological levels. And get myself out of here a little bit. This is fairly simple when you look at the diagram, right? In a course like anatomy and physiology, we're always starting at about maybe the cell level. But let's take it all the way down. If we go all the way down, we're going to start with an atom. And you're starting with an atom, you're putting these together into molecules. These molecules are very important in the human being. These molecules then together, many of them are going to make gigantic molecules. So these are macromolecules, which will form organelles. And these are the organelles that we'll be looking at when we look at cells, right? What kind of organelles are in the cell and what is the function of those? And we'll see that next. So that moves up from organelle, which is the parts of the cell, the little organs. Organelle means little organ. So the little organ of the cell to the actual component cell. Now we've only got one cell though. Let's put lots of those cells together. And that's how we form tissues. So we're going to look at muscle, how it behaves. That's just a bunch of muscle cells together and it's going to behave in a certain way. Then, with those tissues, we manufacture organs. Now, the organ can have more than one tissue, for sure. You can have an organ, you can have a heart that has this muscle tissue, which is cardiac tissue. On the outside, it has fat. It has an epithelial tissue, which is the coating of it. So it's not just one tissue, but many tissues that are going to make up those organs. And then many organs that make up the system. And in this example of the diagram there, what you have is the digestive system, and it's showing, liver and stomach and all the intestine. So these building blocks that have sort of increased up into the organism, which is the child in the picture there, has come from its little component parts. And the way we study that mostly in anatomy and physiology is we study systems. We study the digestive system and the muscular system. So that's kind of how we attack this big, difficult problem of understanding a human being. Hard to understand. 3, the cell is the basic unit of life. And I seem to always be behind something. That's our next chapter, right? Basic unit of life. In other words, when you go beyond that, when you go to the atom, it's not living. So it's not a unit of life. We have to put it together into molecules and macromolecules and then form a cell. And at that point, we can call it life. Multicellular organisms then are made of a lot of different tissues, made of different cells, and they're going to have this very specialized function. When you think of a cell, I always call it Joe cell, that picture of the round cell, and in the middle it has a nucleus, and then it has mitochondria. It's like cells are not like that. Some are, but most of them, think of a neuron, a big long neuron that doesn't look like Joe's cell at all. A muscle cell doesn't look like Joe's cell at all. So very interesting, the diversity of these cells in order to make this human being that we're making function. But always the cell is that basic unit of life. 4, the basic cell function is communication. So cells need to signal between each other, right? They need to say, stop growing now, we've grown enough. They need to say, send a hormone, over to this other part of the body. And that communication is super important. In fact, we have not conquered a huge problem, which is cancer, because we can't figure out that cell communication. What is it that's telling one cell to grow, to reproduce, and then to do it again and again and again and again out of control? What is that communication happening there? We have a problem understanding that. So that's a very important thing, how cells signal between each other. They signal with hormones, they signal with neurotransmitters, with all sorts of chemicals. And it's that information flow between these trillions of cells that you have that's going to make this human being function, right? Because if there's discordance between them, then we have failure of it functioning. 5, materials flow down gradients. Oh gosh, we're going to hear this so much when we're talking about physiology. A concentration gradient. Things move in the body. They move from where to where. They move from where there's a lot of it to where there's less of it, right? That's a concentration gradient. So diffusion in the diagram that you're seeing here is, here are these little purple dots. It's some sort of molecule that's trying to get across this cell membrane, and there's many here, and there's very few here, and this membrane is permeable to that one particular molecule, and it will cross, it will go there. Sometimes we need a carrier, sometimes we need a protein because it's not allowed to cross just on its own. So we have a protein carrier. And there's all sorts of different ways in which we can facilitate that diffusion when it is unable to cross the membrane on its own. But so important. How do things get from one place to the next? Okay, when we're talking about respiratory system, how does the oxygen get from one place to the next? How is it that you actually inflate the lung? How is it? What are those pressure gradients going on that allows you to fill your lung or be able to exhale? What about the heart? You know, when you have squeezing, you have the increased pressure of blood shooting out of the aorta. So how these materials flow from place to place is one of those major concepts in physiology. 6, evolution. So human form and function really is a result of evolution. So this is going to be able to explain the diversity in the body, the diversity of all life, really, how it got to be that way, because it's better adapted to be that way and functions better and has health and is able to leave offspring in the next generation. So it's been influenced by that ability to pass on these genes when something works well. And this is a very big concept here with homeostasis. So homeostasis, stasis is to stay. So the idea is that many different levels that you have in your body have to stay the same for this body to function well. Temperature has to stay. Can't go too high, can't go too low. pH. You can't really go out of control with pH. That won't work. What else? You have to regulate different, other examples can I give you? Hormone levels, glucose levels in your blood. It can't go skyrocketing and go back down again. You have to maintain this relatively constant internal environment. Relatively, because it does fluctuate a little bit. So, as a definition, you have it here, the maintenance of a relatively constant internal environment. And that is going to be optimal for cellular function. So this is probably, if I had to pick one, I think homeostasis is probably the most important concept in physiology. So we'll be talking a lot about that. Look at this little diagram, and this is going to help you understand some of this or remember it all. I hope you're remembering all this. An organism in homeostasis is living happily ever after, but all of a sudden there's either an external change or an internal change. We have climate that's occurring outside or things that are happening inside. And this internal change results in a loss of homeostasis. You could have increased temperature, for example, right? And so the organism is going to have to compensate. It's going to have to fix that, because that is something that is out of balance, and you need to fix that. So that compensation is what is happening in your body every single second of the day. When you're sitting down, your heart is beating quite happily and distributing oxygen, and all of a sudden you stand up, and now it has to pump against more of this gravity. You stood up, it's more difficult to do that, and you're instantly compensating. So homeostasis is what is happening, as I said, every second of the day. If the compensation fails, then you are sick, you're ill, you have disease. If the compensation succeeds, you have wellness. And usually the compensation succeeds, right? So that's the balance that you have to achieve. So why maintain these constant levels? That's one of the questions. We said that cellular function is going to work under those conditions. You couldn't, for example, all of a sudden have high carbon dioxide because you weren't breathing or you were at high altitude. What happens? You start getting dizzy, right? You have to, those high CO2 levels, you must compensate in some way and fix that. You can't be low in oxygen, right? That's the hypoxia. And if this is extreme, this could actually lead to death. So homeostasis is what is going to keep you functioning and not ill. And this is just a silly Homer homeostasis. The stimulus here for him is too warm, comes into the brain, which is a sensor, and if he's too warm, he's going to start sweating. The opposite for poor Homer homeostasis here is that too cold, then what you're going to do is you're going to shiver. There's the compensation. One, sweat, get rid of the heat. The other is hold the heat in and shiver, make your muscles move very fast and release some heat. These are all called feedback loops because you understand, you have a sensor determining what seems wrong and you're going to fix it. You're going to change something. So it's called a negative feedback loop, not because it's wrong. Negative implies that that's wrong. Negative is because if too high, then make it low. If too low, then make it high. So do you notice that one is the negative of the other? It's the opposite of the other one. It should be called opposite feedback loops, but it's called negative. So homeostasis is maintained through these loops, and we're going to see many of them, how it is that they provide this constant internal environment, or semi-constant. You have different factors that make up that loop. What are they? One is a stimulus. Well, for Homer homeostasis, there it was the heat, for example. Let's say it got too hot. It's a disturbance. It's a change. It's a change in the environment. It's a change in a controlled variable. So that variable is off. So all of a sudden there's a stimulus, too hot. And if your body couldn't detect it, then you're out of luck. So you need a sensor. You need a sensor that's going to detect that, because if not, you're just going to overheat and burn up and die. So you need a sensor. So the sensor detects that change, and it sends that message to somewhere else in the body that can do something about it, or can send that message to wherever it needs to be delivered to. So a stimulus, a sensor that's going to detect it, and then an integrating center that's going to detect, say, oh, we have a problem here. The sensor is telling us that this is too high. And so I'm going to have to send a message via neurons to some part of the body that can actually do something about it. So the integrating center is kind of like the brain, mostly. And it's saying, okay, we're going to continue on, and I get it. We have a problem, too high. The sensors reported that. We need to change something. So let's go to 4 here. So it goes to the target, meaning who's going to do something about this? The effector.